My name is Sarah, and this is my story, which I carried like a stone behind my cheek for a long time. I was 5 when my dad started packing a suitcase, stroking my hair, but looking through me as if I were a window into another life. He said, "I'll be back," and the door slammed shut as if the sun had been taken out of the room. I remembered the smell of my mom's laundry detergent, her t-shirt with the faded print, and the silence that settled on my shoulder like a bird that no one called. In the evenings, I would draw with felt-tip pens our house, where we were all still together, and my fingers would tremble as if my heart was trying to teach me to write the truth. "Dad's on his way," my mom would whisper, and her eyes would become 2 dark cups with tea cooling in them. When I fell asleep, I dreamed that the door would open by itself and that my father was laughing, but I woke up to the sound of my breathing in the apartment, which was too loud for such a small girl. Then my mother's laughter began to rust. It was warm, like water in the sun, and it became sharp, like a jar lid that won't budge. Strange men would often come to our house, wearing perfume that smelled of cheap courage, and they would leave marks of their glasses on the table as if they were marking their territory. I would hide the drawings under my pillow because in their eyes my colored stars seemed superfluous. My mother would say, "Sarah, this is just a difficult time," and I learned to read her lips when the words wouldn't come out sober. The evenings would drag on like molten tar, and I would set the alarm to check if she would come home. The bottles in the trash can spoke louder than us, and for the first time I realized that silence could smell. I cleaned the kitchen, wiped the table, as if erasing the traces of other people's stories that had entered our home without permission. And every night I whispered to someone invisible, "Please, leave us at least a light in the hallway," and sometimes the hallway really did shine a little longer. Once my mother brought a man in a leather jacket who smelled of gasoline and haste. He laughed as if he wanted to shout out any guilt. I counted the cracks in the ceiling and tried not to listen, but the voices grew through the walls like weeds that don't ask permission. Late at night he slammed the door, and my mother stood barefoot in the middle of the hallway, crying silently, as if her voice had been stolen. In the morning she asked me not to be angry, and I nodded, because I was a child who only knew how to nod. I spread out the cups, spoons, our timid hopes, and I realized how quickly you learn to grow up when there is no one to protect you. In the evening, my mother laughed again, but the laughter creaked like an old door. I pressed the pillow to my chest and imagined a house where someone covered me with a blanket without looking into the bottle. I learned to be invisible when guests came, and became air so as not to disturb. Air is also life, only without the right to vote. That rainy day the roads turned into mirrors. My mother said she would go out to get cigarettes, and I was left to assemble the word hope from the cubes, which stubbornly fell apart. The phone was silent, my neighbor returned from the store too quickly, and her face was red as a stoplight. "Sarah, there's an accident," she whispered, and it seemed to me that the walls had taken a step back. The hospital smelled of chlorine and loss. The doctor spoke slowly, each word a drop falling into an empty bucket. I looked at my mother's hands, no longer warm, and tried to remember how they had braided my hair. In the morning I signed some papers, not understanding what I was signing, children's letters next to adult grief. At the funeral I held her photo as if it could warm my fingers. The rain didn't stop, and it seemed to me that the sky had decided to cry for both of us. I returned home alone, and the apartment was so quiet that even the clock was afraid to tick. After the funeral, my father came, ironed, clean, with eyes that were trying to catch up on the years that had passed. Next to him stood Lori, his wife, with a smile that measured the space between us by the centimeter. "Sarah, come with us, it's better," Dad said. The word "better" was put in the trunk, and we left. Their house was like a showcase. No dust, no footprints, no random things. I was afraid to step on the wrong thing. In the kitchen, the cups stood in a row like soldiers, and my drawings frightened this discipline, so I hid them at the bottom of the suitcase. Lori said quietly, but so that it could be heard, "A girl should be grateful." A girl. I lost my name like a glove on a bus. In the evenings, Dad read the news, and I looked out the window and with every reflection of light, looked for my mother's shadow. The new room smelled of laundry soap and someone else's bedding. I put my things on a shelf like letters that would never be sent. School became both a refuge and a trap. In the library, the paper smelled of rain, and books held my hand when I was afraid to breathe. I read about heroines who emerged from the darkness, and I learned to walk quietly so as not to disturb Laura. Her eyes glided over me like a stain that could not be washed away. She carefully folded my father's shirts and just as carefully composed stories about my shortcomings. She doesn't try, she's rude, she has to, the words orders whispered next to the coffee maker. Dad nodded, tiredly, as if these phrases had lived here for a long time. I returned to my room, clean so there was nothing to complain about, and held a pencil in my palm like a key to a door that didn't exist. Sometimes I touched the phone, looked at the contact, Mom, and didn't delete it, because deleting it meant agreeing. I learned to breathe invisibly so as not to waste their air. And every night I whispered to my pillow, someday I'll choose myself. I was 15 when I met Alex at the vending machine. He tapped the machine on the side, and the can fell out empty. Here, he said, and smiled as if for the first time in a long time someone had seen me and not my mistakes. Alex knew how to listen in silence. We walked along the river, and I told him about my mother, about my father's house, about Lori, who had measured me by the inches of existence. He simply held my hand and said, "You don't have to prove anything. You are enough." That evening I packed my things, a few t-shirts, a notebook, a toothbrush, drawings. Lori said, "Ungrateful," and my father was silent, staring at the floor. I waited for him to say, "Stay," but the door hadn't taught him to speak. I went with Alex on a night when the city was buzzing with other people's stories, and for the first time in a long time I wanted to be in one of them. We laughed with relief, and I walked lightly, as if a heavy, guilty sign had been lifted from me. We found a room above a small shop. The window was against a brick wall, but inside there was a bed and 2 mugs that we had given each other. Alex settled into the workshop, returning smelling of grease and fatigue, but with hugs as huge as new cards. I worked part-time at a coffee shop, washing cups until the skin on my hands looked like the weather. In the evenings we shared pizza and planned how we would get on our bikes, ride to the ocean at dawn, and shout names we liked. I would stick my drawings on the wall, and the world would become wider. We were poor, but this poverty smelled of warmth, not fear. When Alex fell asleep, I wrote in my notebook, "It's safe here." I had never written that truthfully before. And yet, sometimes a shadow lived inside me, the knowledge that my safety was often on my watch, and I listened to see if the timer was going off. The first cracks trembled like strings, subtle but impossible not to hear. Alex began to come home late, silent, his laughter cutting against the edge of the table. One day he brought a guy, a friend, who sold pills, and said, "It's just a booster." I pushed the word addiction aside like an unnecessary box, but the boxes in the drawer multiplied, and the smell of beer took root in the pillows. I made soup, asked him to go to bed early, said that we needed work, a shopping list, water instead of beer. He nodded, kissed my forehead, promised, but the promises peeled away like paint. I held his hand, as if I could hold the current. After another, "Everything is under control," the room became so cramped that I had to go out onto the stairs to catch my breath. I promised myself, I will not let the darkness make a nest inside me. And yet every night I woke up to someone rustling in the darkness, sweeping my hope into an invisible package. Strangers began to appear in the apartment. Their eyes were locks without keys, their hands were quick as pickpockets. They laughed in a way that was not their own and spoke as if every word had a small coin in it. Alex bargained for things that had been important to us yesterday, the speakers, my paints, even the blanket I had wrapped my fear in. Temporarily, he kept repeating, and temporarily fell to the floor like a nut that no longer holds anything together. When I returned from the cafe one evening, the pictures on the walls had disappeared. "We'll buy the best ones," he said, not meeting my eyes. I could smell the smell of fear, sour, pungent, like a beaten lemon. I packed a notebook and a few pencils into a box, like a reserve of air, and for the first time I thought that love without borders was a door without a lock, through which the winds could come in whenever they wanted. I whispered into my pillow, "Don't betray yourself." The arrest happened as mundanely as a broken alarm clock. 2 men in uniform knocked, called his name, I stood with a mug in my hand so that no one could see my fingers shaking. The station smelled of papers, of other people's stories that no one had finished. Drugs, theft, they said, as if reading a list from the supermarket. I expected Alex to look around, to look for me with his eyes, as he had looked for his keys before. But he looked past, through, somewhere where I wasn't. "Sorry," he said curtly. 6 letters without an address. I went outside, and the rain began without a command. The water erased our plans from the sidewalk like chalk. I was walking home and suddenly felt that, carrying my fatigue, I was still able to carry myself. The room was empty, not scary, empty. And I sat down and let the silence speak. She said, "Now, you." The emptiness became a canvas. I cleaned the room, leaving behind a kettle, a lamp, a blanket, a few books, and my notebook. I asked myself, what can I give myself? The answer was unexpectedly simple and terrifying: love. I was tired of begging for it where it didn't exist, and I decided to give birth to it, literally. I read about IVF, the injections, the waiting, the statistics of probabilities. I was scared of percentages, but I learned not to be a percentage. I saved up money, more shifts in my work schedule, custom postcards, extra shifts at the coffee shop. I wove a rope out of my fatigue and used it to cross the abyss of doubt. On my first morning without Alex, I made myself some toast and said out loud, "Hello, Sarah." My voice surprised me. It wasn't thin, it wasn't childish. It was mine. And then I wrote on a piece of paper, "I choose motherhood." It was a decision without fireworks, but I had never seen the starry sky closer. The clinic greeted me with white corridors and short smiles that try not to promise too much. The doctor spoke in a balanced manner, laying out the days, procedures, ups and downs, as if she were laying out a route in the mountains. I held the pen so tightly that my fingers turned white. The first injection was a rush, the second became a ritual of the journey. I started a diary where I numbered my hopes so that they would not get lost in the corridors of fear. During the days of waiting, I drew tiny planets and signed them with words that I lacked: tenderness, patience, comfort. The nurse touched my shoulder. "You are very brave." I did not feel brave, only focused. One morning I woke up to a strange calmness, of body and mind. The tests confirmed what I was afraid to wish for out loud. I went outside, stopped under a tree, and smiled at the leaves. I carried a new light within me, and the light seemed to recognize me. Pregnancy taught me slowness. I walked along the river and touched the railings, checking if they would withstand our laughter. The city became gentler, the subway sang its own rhythm, cafes opened to meet us, and even the rain fell as if it didn't want to scare me. I whispered stories to the baby about the two of us, about how we would bake pancakes and listen to old records. The doctor said everything was fine, and I answered with my eyes, "Really?" At night I dreamed of my mother, without bottles, without cracks in her voice. She would straighten my blanket and say, "Breathe, daughter." I breathed. I bought little socks and couldn't believe that anyone would actually wear them. On the refrigerator hung magnets with words I was trying to tame: calm, trust, think positive. I learned to say yes to myself even when the world said, "We'll see." Labor came like a storm in which I learned to choose the waves. The pain rolled and receded. I caught the rhythm like a song I had heard before but didn't recognize. When the first cry sounded, a door opened inside me. I saw Max, warm as fresh milk, light as an exhalation after a long silence. I touched his fingers and realized, this was my answer to myself. The ward smelled sterile, but to me it smelled like home. The nurse said we were doing well, and for the first time I smiled not for anyone but for myself. I held Max to my chest and listened to our hearts negotiate. From that moment on, everything in me was reorganized, fears in the bottom drawer, hopes closer than a toothbrush. I whispered, "Hello, son." Those were the two most powerful words I knew. For the first few months, we danced in the kitchen to the sound of the kettle. I learned to cook with one hand, to write down ideas on napkins, to fall asleep between his breaths. We didn't have much money, but we had many reasons to get up in the morning. My neighbor agreed to watch Max for a few hours while I was at the coffee shop. I drew postcards to order, and for the first time, people paid me for my own world. My pictures reappeared on the wall, now always with two silhouettes. I thought about Alex sometimes, but the thoughts were like old tickets. You can keep them, but they don't take you anywhere else. When fear crept in at night, I would put my hand on Max's back and feel life breathing without anyone else's permission. I didn't talk to my dad, he probably still had my number, but I didn't touch that scar. I wasn't ready. I was just learning to carry myself and the one who had trusted me from the first cry. When Max was 6 months old, I felt that our house was cramped by other people's shadows. I found a small apartment with windows overlooking the park and walls that knew no fears of mine. We painted the kitchen a warm shade of morning, the neighbor boy helped move the sofa, and I baked a cake to thank the world. The move was like a march of small victories, boxes labeled dishes, memories, hopes. I washed the blanket of old smells, and it suddenly became lighter, as if I had decided to start over too. In the park, we got to know the trees. I memorized the benches where it was nice to read and the path where the stroller rolls smoothly. The new home spoke to me honestly. I'm not perfect, but my space is yours. And I answered just as honestly. In the evening, when Max fell asleep, I opened my laptop and looked up illustration courses. I wanted my son to see how his mother chooses herself and doesn't apologize for it. I signed up for a course, took freelance work, drew for children's publications. While Max slept, I drew lines, straight, bold, true. Every now and then, the past would wash over me like a wave, Lori with her looks, my dad, who had learned to be silent better than any speaker, Alex, who had chosen the darkness. I let the waves pass. Shells remained on the shore, lessons polished to a shine. I thought about Max's name every day, my son guiding me back to it like a compass. And one morning, when the light fell just right on the windowsill, I picked up the phone and dialed my dad's number. My finger hovered over the button, and my heart pounded like it did at school before answering. I pressed call. Years rustled through the receiver. Hello? Dad's voice was older than I remembered, but with the same note that I seemed to resent most. Hello, Dad. This is Sarah. A long pause. Daughter, so quietly that I leaned against the wall. I said everything I had in mind. I have a son, he's almost a year old, his name is Max. In your honor, I live in another city, I'm learning to be myself. The receiver was filled with shame that finally had an address. I don't deserve it, he whispered. But thank you. Can I see you? We agreed to meet at a cafe near the park. After the conversation, I sat on the floor for a long time, holding the phone in my hand, and felt the walls getting wider. I was afraid and wanted, at the same time, as always in life. I made Max his favorite mashed potatoes and collected all our best smiles in a backpack. We arrived first. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and new beginnings. Max was a year old. He held on to my fingers like a rope to the sky, and laughed seriously, like a man who knew a secret. When Dad came in, I recognized him immediately, wrinkles, averting his gaze, and something new, caution. He sat down, not touching the table with his hands, as if afraid of ruining our chance. This is Max, I said. Dad held out a finger and stopped. I barely nodded. Max touched him, and that touch included everything we were running away from. Hello, little one, Dad said and cried silently. I looked at the two of them and felt something inside me turn to a blank page. We talked timidly, about the apartment, about parks, about books. Dad asked if I drew. I nodded and didn't hide. He started coming every weekend. He brought apples from the farmer's market, thick picture books, little socks that smelled of new. Lori wasn't around, and I didn't ask where she was. Sometimes silence is easier than answers. We walked in the park, Dad awkwardly pushing the stroller, learning to turn as if he were learning a new alphabet. He talked about the fear of poverty that had once been greater than anything else, and how he had run away from that fear until it had run away from himself. I listened, not deciding for him who he was now. He laughed when Max made serious eyes, and took pictures of our shadows stretching ahead. After our walks, we drank tea in the kitchen, and I wondered how easy it was sometimes to sit in silence with someone you once wanted to run away from forever. My heart hadn't forgotten, but it had learned not to ache with every breath. One morning he called and offered to help with the renovation. "Lower the shelves, so you can be more comfortable," Dad said, and I agreed. We spread out the kitchen plan on the table, laughed when something didn't work out the first time, and put the screws in a cup labeled "beginning." Max crawled along like a little quality inspector. In the breaks, we talked about Mom. Dad remembered her real laughter, the one that was before the shadow. She loved baking cherry pies, he smiled, and I suddenly smelled the smell of childhood, not spoiled by other people's voices. Together we fixed the new faucet, and the water poured evenly, like a phrase we finally dared to utter. I realized that something had leveled out in me. The angle at which I looked at the world had become closer to the horizon. When he left, there was more space in the apartment. There was air between things, light between thoughts. He would send me funny text messages and photos of sunrises on the way to work. I would reply with emojis, and then with words. We would choose animal books for Max and build our love vocabulary, more, together, you can. But something inside me still listened warily. What if it was all fragile? I squeezed this anxiety like a pebble in my pocket, and it would get warmer. One evening, I found my childhood note in an old notebook. "Someday I will choose myself." I read it and realized, I had already chosen. Not against anyone, for myself, for Max, for the truth. And then the fragility stopped ringing, it simply became part of the crystal our glasses are made of. They can be protected. Once, Lori called. Her voice was smooth, like a freshly starched tablecloth. She asked why I had, suddenly, returned to his life, and if I didn't think I had had enough drama. I listened and felt the girl with the suitcase rise inside me. I answered calmly, "I didn't come to take it away. I came to return the truth." She laughed nervously and hung up the phone. I cried, but the tears were warm in color, not from defeat, but from relief. That evening, Dad wrote, "I won't let anyone speak for us anymore." I answered, "We don't need fights. We need rules." We made up our own, to speak in time, to ask instead of guessing, not to punish with silence. It sounds simple, but for me it was a new language in which love means, I am here. In the fall, we went out of town for a day. The field smelled of apples and cold, the road was as clean as a page. Max, a serious little 1-year-old man, was playing with his own shadow, and I laughed at him the way my mother had once laughed at me. Dad and I sat on a bench. The wind was saying something to the grass that I could feel on my skin. "Sarah," Dad said, "I have no right to apologize. But I have a duty to live so that you don't have to hurt anymore." It wasn't a triumph or a slogan. It was a step. I nodded. We were feeding the birds cookie crumbs, and they would come very close, like trust learning to land on your palm. On the way back, I noticed that the sky had become higher. It must have been lifted by our imperceptible conversations, real, without holes. Today, Dad came to visit us. Without any big plans, without speeches. He came in and hugged me as if he had finally found the door he had been trying to find for a long time. In the suitcase were a few shirts, old photos, and a notebook in which I saw my own childhood drawings. He had kept them. "Sarah," he said, "I didn't know how to be there. I always loved you very much." I didn't know how to say it, and I hid from my shame. I stood in the kitchen, holding Max, who was reaching for Dad's beard, and felt my world expand without destruction. We made tea, spread cookies on a plate. Dad read Max poems, confusing the rhymes, and was the first to laugh. I looked at them and thought, sometimes love returns without fanfare, with apples, a children's book, and the simple right to be. And this time I believe it.